you so much, Andrea. So, as Andrea's already explained, I'm a lecturer in EU business law here at UCLan Cyprus, but for now we'll be staying online. I'm focusing today on a very interesting topic, which is more or less ideas of a very long and in a long-term project, let's say, on citizenship. So what I will be looking at is citizenship after and before crisis, basically. So what I care about and what I'm specializing in is the concept of citizenship, both on the national and the EU level. And today I will be focusing on populism, and I will try to see whether a populist reading can be identified for citizenship, and if this populist reading exists, whether this has any consequences on the concept of citizenship supranationally or nationally. And before I go into the populist ideas, I will also show you a table of how I perceive citizenship and how I think that then different crises are affecting citizenship and find a correlation there. So I will be explaining throughout the workshop what we will be doing. And as I already said, you are welcome to post questions in chat or to just switch on your microphones and interrupt me if you have questions or if you have comments. And of course, in the end as well, I will try to leave as much time as possible for discussion. Okay, so starting with very general, so what is citizenship? So currently, there has been a lot of interest in citizenship, especially during the last years, not only from politicians, but also from church leaders, from the industry, from NGOs, from campaigning groups, people supporting global causes. So it's very topical, at least in my opinion. And also governments across the globe have been changing policies in citizenship, how you acquire citizenship, how you revoke citizenship sometimes, and also schools and universities have started to show more interest in citizenship studies. So what I will be doing today, the overview, is I will give you some background, a more theoretical background on what is citizenship and what kind of models of citizenship we can have. Then I will also discuss very, very briefly the EU at the supranational level of citizenship. And then I will go into the crisis situation and how crises are affecting the concept of citizenship with a focus on populism. So in the very strict sense, let's say, citizenship is a legal status that means a person has a right to live in a state and that state cannot refuse them entry or deport them. And this legal status may be conferred at birth. In some states, it could even be obtained by naturalization. I will explain these kind of things later on. And of course, in more wealthy, liberal democratic states, citizenship brings with it some rights to vote, rights to welfare, education, or healthcare. So states not only cover most of the earth, as we know, but they also provide the basic structure for a secure and fulfilled life within societies of any complexity. So if you don't have a citizenship, basically, you are stateless. And statelessness almost always results when there's a state failure of a kind that leads people to flee, whether this is an invasion by another state, whether this is a civil war or an oppressive regime, let's say. So those in this condition and do not live outside any state. Rather, they are forced to become supplicants, if you want, for whatever aid or support those states are willing to give them. And they may remain stateless for years until they are able to obtain a citizenship of any kind, which is becoming harder and harder in some member states. And we will see whether populism has anything to do with this. So the question that I will firstly pose is whether citizenship is an evolving concept. So historically, citizenship has been linked to the privileges of membership of a particular kind of political community. So a person who had a citizenship were those persons that could enjoy a certain status, and they were mostly participating on an equal basis with their fellow citizens in the collective decisions that were regulating the social life. So in other words, traditionally, citizenship has gone hand in hand with political participation in some form of democracy. Over time, these qualities that you needed to become a citizen have changed, and they're still changing, and I will also give examples later on. So starting from a very historical point of view, the so-called Greek model of citizenship, which we mostly know about from the writings of Aristotle, had as a key feature the view that there was equality of citizens as rulers or makers of the law. So whoever had citizenship back in Athens, in ancient Athens, were basically participating in the decision-making processes. Now, in order to be a citizen back then, it was necessary to be a male aged 20 or over, of a known genealogy, and you had to be born as from an Athenian citizen family. You had to own a household, to be a warrior, and you had to be a master of the labor of others. So you needed to have slaves, basically. So as a result, large numbers were excluded from citizenship, including women, children, immigrants, people coming outside of Athens, and of course, slaves. So gender, race, and class were defining citizenship, and many of the main contemporary debates are turning to see how far these traditional and historical conditions may still affect how and whether it's possible for someone to acquire a citizenship. So in the large part, the contemporary concern with citizenship can be seen as reflecting the view that we are currently witnessing a further transformation of political community and so of citizenship, which is produced by impacts of globalization and multiculturalism. And again, we will see how these concepts may affect citizenship. So moving from the traditional citizenship and confirming that it is an evolving concept, we will now see the modern citizenship. So in general, as a global concept, it is encountered with different forms and structures, as well as different content depending on the setting in which it is developed. So it is generally understood as referring to a status of equal membership within a bounded polity. So in other words, in more contemporary societies, it is defined as a homogeneous legal and political status within the context of a nation state, while in the current dominant meaning, the only form of a membership that may be termed citizenship is the membership in a sovereign country, according to William Mass. However, despite the dominance of a single, homogeneous and state-based citizenship narrative, the comparative history of citizenship provides numerous examples of multi-level citizenship. So besides being an evolving concept in the conditions you need to satisfy to acquire a citizenship, it's also evolving in its forms. So the more traditional approach was that citizenship is really state-based. Nowadays, and also because of globalization, we see other forms of citizenship, like multi-level citizenships. And of course, the most prominent example of that is EU citizenship. And I will see that in a bit. So in the words of Mass again, citizenship should be seen as a construction of political and legal practices and of territorial affiliations that are not limited by physical borders, but can also be broader, belonging in a union, belonging in an organization, or even lower in the scale, like belonging in a region. Now, besides the form it takes, modern citizenship also has different content. So despite the structure of citizenship that is different depending on the setting, there are also debates that occur that are relevant to the content. So whereby a rights model of citizenship could be civic, political, or with social dimensions, which is what we have prevailing mostly. At the same time, the idea of citizenship is frequently pertained to modernity and evolution, which defines the legal position of an individual in a modern nation state. And there is important literature that reflected on this position from earlier stages, where different sets of rights have been expanded over time. So citizenship traditionally started with civil rights in the 18th century, while political rights, mainly voting rights, emerged later on in the 19th century. And of course, not for everyone, because women received this kind of political rights a lot later. And more importantly, inspired by more modern drives, if you want, during the 19th century, citizenship also included social rights. In particular, according to Marshall's historical narratives, citizenship included rights to economic welfare and security, rights to share to the full in the social heritage, and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society. And of course, since Marshall's model, citizenship has expanded a lot. And the most, let's say again, prominent example of a very different structure of citizenship and a very different list of content of rights is that of EU citizenship. So the concept of citizenship of the Union was introduced in the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and it formed the key part of the Union's response that was aiming to provide the glue to help and bind together the nationals of all the member states to create, let's say, kind of a concept of belonging in the Union. And of course, as you can imagine, even before citizenship on the EU level was introduced, there were a lot of debates as to the nature that EU citizenship should have been granted. So the first question was what kind of a model EU citizenship can and should adopt. So the list of suggestions included a market citizenship, so focusing on the rights of economic actors, the free movements, if you want, around the Union. The more social model of citizenship, so emphasizing the social welfare rights, or the republican citizenship, which is based mostly on active citizenship participation in the decision-making process. Eventually, a mixture of all of this was adopted with a focus on market citizenship. Now, another very important question, a more, let's say, structural one, was whether EU citizenship should replicate the citizenship of the state, or whether EU citizenship could create a new post-national form of citizenship, which would not be dependent on the national citizenship. In other words, would citizens acquire a citizenship automatically, an EU citizenship automatically, if they are citizens of a member state, or could they be granted EU citizenship irrespective of what happens nationally? The model of citizenship eventually was the first one. So EU citizenship is always dependent on the national citizenship, and the way that each member state is granting citizenship remains in the hands of the member states. So the Union, in other words, cannot really say to the member states how to grant their national citizenships. So each member state of the European Union and even beyond the Union, you see member states that have completely different schemes of granting citizenship. And within the Union, this is because every person holding the nationality of the member state will then become a citizen of the Union. So it is always dependent on the national citizenship. And together with, oh, and of course, something that I don't have to forget is when and if a national citizenship is revoked for any reason, and we have seen lately cases like that, EU citizenship is automatically revoked as well. So the list of rights that are attached to EU citizenship is automatically revoked if the national member states decide to revoke any national citizenship from an individual. So this EU citizenship is coming with a list of rights attached to it, which is mostly relevant to rights that have to do with movement, free movement around the Union, free residence around the Union, voting rights, protection of diplomatic and consular protection, access to documents. So it's a bit of a mixture of rights coming from different models of citizenship that I mentioned. Now, one of the most important things that came with EU citizenship is the freestanding right to move and reside freely. So for those who are not familiar with EU law, the single market always has the right to the free movement of persons, as we know, which basically means that citizens can move around the Union, work in the Union, live in the Union freely. Now, before EU citizenship, in order to do that, you needed to be an economically active citizen. In other words, you needed to work, to be a student maybe, but that was not completely the case, or a self-employed person. So with EU citizenship, with the introduction, it was the first time that we have a freestanding right to movement of all Union citizens, irrespective of their economic or financial standing. So even if you were a non-economically active citizen, even if you don't have any money or any independent means, you could still, for the first time, exercise these kind of rights equally with other nationals of other member states, using the rights of EU citizenship. And this was also confirmed in the case law of the Court of Justice, where the court said that the Union citizenship is destined to be the fundamental status of nationals of the member states, enabling those who find themselves in the same situation to enjoy the same treatment in law, irrespective of their nationality, subject to such exceptions as are expressly provided for in the treaties. And in the Bombast case, the court also stated that the Treaty on European Union does not require that citizens of the Union pursue a professional or trade activity, whether as an employed or self-employed person, in order to enjoy the rights provided in the list that I mentioned before. So EU citizenship became a very important concept, which is completely independent on the national citizenship. Now, all types of citizenships, and this is where the most original part starts, let's say, have specific components, and there are many theories and many philosophers and many scholars that have developed their own theories on the components of citizenship, on a more theoretical aspect, if you want. Now, the understanding of citizenship that I usually use is that of David Held, because it's simple and it's also helping us to see exactly how each crisis that I will be looking at is affecting each of these components. So whatever the form and model of citizenship, whether this is national or supranational, there is a common understanding on the components of citizenship. And David Helt defined this as meaning a reciprocity of rights and duties towards the community. Citizenship had entailed membership of the community in which one lives one life, and membership has inevitably involved in degrees of participation in the community. So in other words, this definition can give us three interconnected strands to citizenship. The first one is membership. So membership of a democratic political community. How are you granted a citizenship? How are you becoming a member of this club that we call citizenship of Cyprus, citizenship of the UK, citizenship of Germany, or whatever? The second component is rights and duties. So the collective benefits and rights associated with membership. Historically, as I explained before, citizens, people that were granted the citizenship status, were allowed more rights than ordinary people, such as the right to participate in the democracy, own land, or hold office. Today, although it goes without saying sometimes that this is not the case anymore, that citizenship is granted equal to everyone and everyone is equal and everyone is holding the same rights, it's actually still blurred. So I will give you an example. In the United States, citizens must be natural born in the US to be eligible for president. So people that have been naturalized later on with the citizenship of the US are not eligible for presidency. Now, this is just an example to give you an idea of how blurred the lines of citizenship are still today. And in the last component is the participation, which is essentially the community's political, economic, and social processes, and how easily and how let's say more effective it is for a citizen, a person who holds a citizenship, to take part in these community's processes. So these are the three components. And I will now explain the overall idea of the project of citizenship and crisis. So this is, as I said, a longer project, and I was not initially studying populism in this project. But when I came across it, I realized that a populist approach to citizenship can in fact have similar consequences and can similarly affect citizenship as other crises did, like COVID restrictions and measures and the financial crisis measures. So this is a table, and I'm trying to basically explain how each of the components I explained before are affected by each of the crises that I am studying in this more broader project. So the populist approaches to citizenship are, of course, affecting all of the components, and especially membership, which is what I am looking at today. Because populist approaches, and of course, I'm not assuming that there is a populist approach to citizenship. This is part of the question. But the question, if you want, is whether populist is creating more restrictive approaches to the acquisition of citizenship, which is affecting the membership. Rights and duties are, of course, affected by rule of law crises, which are directly connected with populism, as Andreas also mentioned in the beginning. And participation is affected because populist ideas and right-wing populist ideas, if I can say better, affect democratic perspectives of citizenship. And just for general knowledge, and just for you to be able to let's say connect the piece of the puzzle, the COVID-19 restrictions and measures have not directly affected membership, because again, membership is up to each of the member states to define. But because of the restrictions to the borders in a free union, in an open union, there have been distortions of the uniformed approach, if we can say better. In terms of rights and duties, COVID-19 restrictions have obviously affected EU citizenship rights, which are a component, or if you want, a supplement to national rights, because we could not move. Essentially, we could not reside in another member state as we wanted, and that was a violation of free movements around the union, which were, of course, justified. Maybe not all of them, but mostly justified. And COVID-19 restrictions have affected participation. Mostly, or maybe an example, is the right to protest. And we have seen also countries, and maybe Andreas will talk about this during his workshop, we have seen countries that have adopted measures within COVID, basically taking advantage of the so-called emergency situation to adopt measures that were going beyond what we needed to achieve the specific aim. So essentially illegitimate powers that were restricting right to protest, participation in democratic processes, and so on. And of course, the financial crisis measures, which is the first project that I started to work on. Membership has been affected, of course, because of the introduction of new types of membership, like the citizenship by investment schemes, which is a new way of acquiring a citizenship. And this has been prominently a result of the financial crisis. In terms of rights and duties, rights that are associated with citizenship have been affected, especially because we have seen cuts in social benefits, in advantages, because of the restrictions of the budgets during the financial crisis. And in terms of participation, this is mostly relevant to EU citizenship, because we have seen a re-emergence of the economically active citizen. Which is the concept that I explained before. While EU citizenship allowed for the first time the use of EU citizenship rights without the need to be economically active, suddenly the financial crisis measures kind of drove the member states to introduce measures that were only benefiting the economically active citizens. So this has affected the participation. So I will now continue with the populist aspect, but I would really like your feedback and your inputs to maybe discuss the overall idea of the project, to let me know of your ideas if you find any other similarities or differences between the crisis and the common approaches, let's say, to tackle these consequences, and mostly on populism, because this is something very new that I'm working on. Okay, so let me start with the first component, which is membership. So basically, we are here on the map, the membership and the potential populist rating of membership. So the first component, again, is membership, then belonging to citizenship, and this is where we discuss and we consider who is a citizen. So membership lies in the heart of citizenship, and in order to be a citizen is to belong to a given political community. However, this link with membership renders citizenship exclusive in ways that have become increasingly controversial. So it makes citizens part of a selected group who enjoy privileges that are denied to the non-members. And you can, of course, see this very clearly in examples of everyday life with refugees or immigrants and so on. In the past, the examples I gave from the more traditional perspective, people have been excluded internally from membership because we had natural inferiors on race, people outside Athens, for instance, or based on gender, So women were not allowed to have citizenship, or other groups, like children or slaves. Now, many of these internal groups for exclusion have been dropped as baseless, though others remain live issues, as does the unequal effectiveness of the right to vote among different groups, and we will see this later on as well. However, much more recent attention has been paid to external exclusion in this membership. And what I mean by external exclusions is the concentration on changes towards asylum seekers and immigrants, maybe. And here, the tendency, at least in previous decades, is to move towards more inclusive policies, both at the domestic and international levels and on the EU level, to introduce significant measures to help the structure of asylum seekers and so on, to make it more inclusive in a way. However, there are currently high levels of international migration, as you know, and also considering the current situation in Ukraine as well, or even beyond Europe. And the situation could even be characterized as unprecedented, especially during the refugees crisis a few years ago. And this has created a significant intent in the ways that this membership can become more inclusive. And these are also reasons why populist ideas on citizenship have affected this tendency towards more inclusion and has made it a bit more exclusive in a way. So how do we acquire membership? So this is a map that I created to help you guide your way around the different ways of acquiring citizenship, in order to understand later on how each of these types has been affected. So the first way of acquiring citizenship is at birth. And at birth, it is either by descent, the jus sanguinis, as we call it, or the territory of birth, the jus soli. So by descent, the most common form of acquisition of citizenship is by descent, as I explained, and I will explain later what we mean by that. And for the territory of birth, the ius soli, we have both unrestricted ius soli and also restricted. Again, I will explain these terms. The second broader category of acquiring membership is through naturalization. And that is mostly relevant to the period of residence in a country. For instance, you live in a country for 7 years, you are allowed to apply for citizenship. And as a consequence of the financial crisis, we also have investment programs. Investment programs were not created because of the financial crisis, but the applications skyrocket during the financial crisis. So that's why I am always connecting it directly to that type of crisis. For the first category at birth, as I explained, it is mostly by descent, so the jus sanguinis type. And what this means is the right of blood. So is the principle of nationality law, by which citizenship is determined or acquired by the nationality or ethnicity of one or both of the parents of a child. So children at birth may be citizens of a particular state if either or both of their parents have citizenship of that state. By birth abroad, which constitutes by descent, if one of the parents of a person in the UK is a British citizen, then that person can acquire the citizenship by descent at birth. And British citizenship by descent is only transferable to one generation down from the parent who is a British citizen, otherwise than by descent, if the child is born abroad. So in other words, if I have a British parent, I can acquire the British citizenship But if I'm not staying in the UK, I cannot transfer that citizenship to my children, which is not the same in Greece. In Greece, even if you don't live in the Greek territory in a way, you can transfer the citizenship by descent for many generations on and on. Now, the next type at birth is ius soli. So by birth in the territory of a country. So the previous was the right of blood because your parents or one of your parents has that type of citizenship. And now is the right of you to be granted a citizenship because you are born in a country. And this is usually known as the birthright citizenship. Anyone who is born in a country may be able to claim for that citizenship. And we have the unrestricted ius soli, which is basically if a country has that type of right of soil, it's unrestricted. If you just happen to be there for one day and you are born, you are automatically granted the citizenship. We also have the restricted ius soli, which is the trend in some countries towards restricting it by requiring that at least one of the child's parents is a citizen, national or legal permanent resident of the state in question, or different other types of extra requirements besides being born in that country. And of course, this, as you can imagine, was criticized as contributing to economic inequality. And I will explain later on why. And I will also later on give examples of which countries have unrestricted and restricted ius soli. Or maybe I can do it now, actually, since we have the map. So, in fact, no European countries have unrestricted ius soli. There is no place in Europe, in the European Union at least, that you can go give birth and your children can automatically get a citizenship. This used to be the case, but this is no longer the case. And we will see examples of specific countries and see why this has changed and the role that maybe populism has played. Most countries have restricted ius soli, but the US and Canada and most of Latin America still have unconditional ius soli. Of course, some countries, as you can see here, do not even grant the same rights to women and men. But what we mostly care about for the purposes of this presentation is the countries that offer unconditional ius soli and those who grant conditional ius soli. So I will not get into the details of that because it's not necessary for assessing populism, but there are also different types of conditional ius soli, and this is a very helpful graph explaining how flexible and how inclusive the rules are in the different member states of the European Union. Cyprus has no ius soli, so there is no way that you are born in Cyprus and you're automatically granted the citizenship. So going back to our map, the second broad way of acquiring membership is through naturalization. So let's see what this means. So in countries where these ius soli laws do not exist, like Cyprus, the acquisition of citizens must be asked by the individual after birth, most commonly based on the period of residence in a country. So this time can range from 10 years, the maximum required in countries like Italy, Spain, and Austria, and to 3 years, the shortest period in the EU, which is required by Poland. Another requirement can be called the so-called citizenship tests, in which candidates need to prove their knowledge about the country, its legal and constitutional systems, and the general cultural values. And this requirement is present in half of the EU countries, including the UK, of course, just for the purposes of the presentation. So this is how you acquire citizenship. So this is basically the component of a membership. Now, the next question is there a populist reading of citizenship? And more specifically, is there a populist reading of membership? So, and if there is a populist reading of citizenship, has this affected the citizenship policies in any way? So before we do so, let me just give a very brief analysis of what we mean by the populist ideology. And I'm sure that the rest of the speakers will go into more detail with this, and people that are also more experts in the field than I am. So populist, assigned as an ideology or a movement, let's say, considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale of the people, the general will of the people. So populism seeks to speak in the name of the common people. Its distinctive features are the prioritization of popular sovereignty, the people, then direct democracy, and the strong emphasis on anti-elitism, so against the corrupt elite. Beyond, of course, these shared features of populism, populism also emerges in a variety of forms. And while populism is hostile to elites, it is also vague and moralistic in a way, and as such, quite easily instrumentalized by almost any type of ideology, both left and right. And because it has no core values and it is very thin as an ideology. Sorry, I just admitted someone in the room. So there exist several rather than different varieties of populism. So we can see populist ideas from a more socioeconomic approach, from a more xenophobic approach, a reactionary, authoritarian approaches, and progressive populism. So some of these ideas claim to stand for protecting the welfare state of citizens, enabling the party to tap the populist parties, I mean, to tap a broad variety of different political constituencies and cultural values, or sometimes the opposition leaders are delegitimized by populist parties through being cast as not caring about the ordinary citizens, about the ordinary Polish, the ordinary Germans, the ordinary Hungarians, but only about the interest of the various liberal elites. So, taking this very simplistic reading of populism, which is also a very general idea, I will try to see whether this setting, this reading, actually exists in the studies of citizenship. So the general, let's say, argument is that the rise of populism, which is a very contested political phenomenon, represents one of the central challenges to the ideas of equal citizenship across the globe. So the question is whether the populist worldview that I mentioned before is also echoed in the appreciation of citizenship and the citizen, and if so, what consequences this view has had or is having or will have on citizenship rights. In other words, is the population also divided into the pure group, those with the national citizenship, and a corrupt one, those holding a different citizenship or those holding no citizenship? So the way that the citizen is conceptualized better corresponds to established definitions of populism. So depending on how you define what a citizen is and what requirements you need to become a citizen, it plays a role to assess and see whether the population can be divided into this populist, let's say, framework. So that said, it's also important to say that using the label populism may be inaccurate, since populism is also described as a thin ideology which attaches itself either to parties of the left or the right. And in other words, what I'm trying to say is that populism does not automatically mean that such parties hold anti-immigration positions as well. Whether populism takes a left or a right turn can be explained as a consequence of the perceived relative deprivation of civic, political, or social rights. Consequently, while both versions, left and right populism, seek to restore the citizenship rights, they employ, let's say, different strategies against the different other. So against this corrupt one, the concept of the other within the populist reading of citizenship. So for the sake of understanding this, the right-wing populist reaffirm national community by combining a Republican majoritarian discourse with a critique of the cosmopolitan elitism, with a critique of the elitist society and the ethnic or religious minorities. On the other hand, the left-wing populist seek to build a community among socially marginal groups by combining a discourse of pluralist inclusiveness, so different minorities may be in different religious or ethnic minorities in a more inclusive way, with a critique of capitalistic elitism. So populism itself is not the issue here. So we are not trying to let's say automatically assume that populism holds anti-immigration positions as a whole. The exclusionary populism is what we care about, which mostly comes from the right-wing populist, as I will see in a bit. And the exclusive populism is mostly about nativism. So this policy of protecting the interests of native-born or established inhabitants of a country against those of immigrants. Sorry, just let me switch on the air condition. It's so hot in Cyprus. If you're not in Cyprus, it's really hot. Okay, so what we care about here is the exclusionary populism, which could lead to anti-immigration, xenophobia, anti-multiculturalism, so Islamophobia, Afrophobia, anti-Semitism. So all of these concepts are not, let's say, directly connected to populism more generally, but to exclusionary populism, at least within the reading of membership and citizenship. So I see something in the chat. Is it a question or is... No, okay, it's Andreas. Okay. So moving forward, now that I explained and clarified the need to have in mind the exclusionary populism, let's continue with the question of whether there is a populist reading of membership. So what sets apart the far-right populist parties is the role that nativism plays. And that is a combination of nationalism and xenophobia, and the idea that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, the nation, and that non-native or alien elements are fundamentally threatening to the homogeneous nation state. So the citizen is understood as to have a unique set of traits where the non-citizen does not possess this kind of unique traits. The migrant other in the populist framework is especially daunting since she or he brings different faith, different languages, and social practices to the nation. And if further immigration is not strictly regulated, then in the long run, the idea is that it will dilute the essence of the people. According to Mad, this scholar points to the unholy trinity of nativism, authoritarianism, and populism to characterize the non-mainstream parties who push the hardline position on immigration and integration. So in other words, based on what I explained before, the exclusionary populism, which is what could possibly affect membership within citizenship, is coming from right-wing parties, extreme right-wing populism. And the reason is because it is mostly equalized, if you want, with nativism and authoritarianism. Now, the so-called populism stance has become synonymous with kind of draconian approaches to border control and how to incorporate migrants into the host society. So migrants from a populist reading, let's say, and I explain what I mean by populist, are not only perceived as a threat to the national identity, but they are also seen as undermining the notion of shared responsibility, which is needed in a society that is based on solidarity and common resources and common ideas on how we process as a society. So a populist idea, a right-wing populist idea could possibly say that it's not only a threat to the national identity for the reasons I explained, because it is diluting the people, the original, but it's also undermining shared responsibility. However, practically speaking, and besides the more theoretical aspect, there are two different approaches that exist currently to exclusive citizenship. And that is conditions that are showing a more unified function of citizenship or a cultural assimilation. So if we ask the question of whether a populist reading exists on membership, then the answer theoretically could be yes. But we need to see the policies adopted to decide whether this is true in practice. So the two different approaches is the unifying function of citizenship and the cultural assimilation. For instance, in Denmark, the Danish People's Party emphasized, sorry, there is a question, Andrea.
Thank you, Katerina. Yes, I'd like to ask something, maybe clarify a little bit. This idea of shared responsibility, right? That is mentioned here. And I was wondering, is that linked to duties of citizenship that you described earlier? Or is it an idea that, for instance, oh, migrants come into this country and they don't pay their fair share in terms of, taxes, and they only want to take the benefits? Is that what you mean by shared responsibility? So is it an idea that, oh, citizens contribute to our legal system by paying taxes primarily, whereas migrants don't? Or is it an idea of shared responsibility in a more abstract sense, in the sense of maintaining a community and they are a threat to it because they undermine the homogeneity of the community?
Thank you for the question. So it's a bit of both, basically. Can you mute your microphone, Andreas? There is an echo. Thank you. So it's a bit of both, basically, because all of the components of citizenship I discussed before are interconnected. The way that you acquire membership to actually acquire the citizenship eventually is directly relevant to the rights and duties and participation. So the shared responsibility belongs in everything. If we're talking about rights and duties, it's exactly what you described. The duties that we have as citizens in a society is a shared responsibility, whether this is an army obligation to serve the army, whether this is taxation, whether this is the component of participation to be more active citizen in the participation of the decision-making processes, or whether this is more abstract in the maintaining of the peace of the society. So for the populist reading, when I'm referring to how the migrants are perceived, it's again a bit of everything, but I would say mostly the more general idea of how we work together as a society. And we are the people, and the others, the aliens, let's say, the corrupted elite, but from the citizenship perspective, are the ones that cannot share this responsibility with us because they speak a different language, because they have different ethnic origin, and so on and so forth. Is the answer clear? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Katerina. Yes, please proceed.
Perfect. Okay.
You switched a microphone. We can't hear you.
Thank you so much. I did that by mistake. It's happening a lot. Thank you for letting me know. So as I explained before, if we want to assess whether a populist reading exists in a more theoretical framework for citizenship, we could say that yes, very well it does, because a lot of right-wing parties, even in their memorandums and in their manifestos for the elections, are talking a lot about this distinction between the native people, the original ones, the popular sovereignty, if you want, against the others, which is, let's say, equivalent to the corrupt elite. Now, if we want to see if this populist reading exists in practical terms, we need to assess the two approaches that exist mostly in the policies adopted from the member states. So the first approach is the unifying function of citizenship, and the second one is the cultural assimilation. For instance, in Denmark, the Danish People's Party emphasized the unifying function of citizenship and how a shared language, a set of values, and a certain basic view all forms part of the Danish culture, and all of this is needed for someone to be a citizen of Denmark. Now, the Citizens Democrats Party is an example of the second. So this party has a particular take on what it means to be Swedish. And it invites migrants and their descendants to become citizens as long as they're prepared for a significant cultural assimilation. However, there are cases that this is not possible to be done. So migrants that originate from far away have completely different cultural, geographical, and religious ideas, and it is less likely that they can assimilate since they are said to hold particularly strong attachment to their home cultures. So although one of the two is seen as more flexible in a way, both of these approaches to migrants and membership policies are exclusive. Now, if we say that the cultural assimilation is the tendency in most of the member states, then is the cultural assimilation really a populist idea? This is where I want to go now for the debate. So the truth is that, and I have examples later on as well, is that the unifying function of citizenship is not used practically. I mean, member states are not expecting migrants to share the language, share the ethnic origin, or have this unifying approach to citizenship in order to grant them membership. What they're mostly expecting migrants to have is this significant cultural assimilation. So let's see whether this is populist or not. So as far as the far-right populist parties are concerned, it does not have a purely populistic understanding of citizenship or the citizen. Its significant feature of the people is not necessarily based on the distinction between pure and corrupt group, and that is citizens versus non-citizens. The overview instead suggests a mixture of EU sanguinis, what I discussed before, the specific type of getting citizenship by descent, cultural assimilation, and mostly racist interpretations of belonging. So although citizenship as a legal status was and still is interpreted along authoritarian and nativist lines, the assimilation continues to be the most important prerequisite for formal inclusion into the polity. So for actually formally becoming a member of this exclusive club. Accordingly, citizenship is almost something sacred to hold, and far-right populist parties attach substantial value to it. In policy terms, again, it typically means lengthy residence requirements, no automatic EU soli rights, so no automatic birthright to citizenship, and a variety of tests to filter out those non-nationals who are deemed to be unable to assimilate. So if we see the examples practically in the policy, we can conclude that citizenship is not really seen from a populist idea because it is not strictly distinguishing between the pure and the corrupt group. What is mostly focusing on is who can assimilate and who cannot. So it is more welcoming if you want, but based on specific conditions. So let me give you some more practical examples. So from the unrestricted ius soli that I explained before, which is the first way that you can acquire citizenship by birth, at birth, the US is the most, let's say, known country for still having unrestricted ius soli. So the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which was ratified in 1868, provides that all persons born or naturalized in the US and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, from the 24th of January 2020, the Trump administration adopted a new policy to make it more difficult for foreign nationals to obtain a non-immigrant visa to travel to the US to give birth on US soil, so basically the EU soil right, to ensure that their children become US citizens. So this is a practice that is commonly known as birth tourism, whereby foreign nationals are obtaining a relevant visa to travel to the US and give birth. Now, besides making it harder to obtain for this specific type of visa to prevent people from being born in the US, the conservatives in the United States have very often called for legislative reforms, including an amendment to the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment to end the EU solely right in the United States, so to end the birthright citizenship in the US, particularly for children born to persons unlawfully present in the country. So there is a tendency in the last few years to push for amendments to end the unrestricted EU soli, which is also what happened in Europe, in the member states of the European Union. Now, again, the restricted EU soli, as I explained, is this trend that in some countries they move towards including requirements that at least one of the parents of the child is either a citizen or a national or a legal resident, permanent resident in the state at the question at the time of the child's birth. So the modification of EU soli has been criticized as contributing to economic inequality. And this is also because a lot of people fly to Europe from wars or from invasions or from any other, for any other reasons that they're, let's say, pushed to flee their country. And when they come to Europe, they're stateless, and it's almost impossible for them or for their kids to get any type of citizenship. And in Belgium is actually the last, and Ireland are actually the last two countries that stopped the EU soli scheme very recently. And this was as a result of a case called Ruiz-Zambrano for people who are relevant with EU law. So after this case, where kids of immigrants were able to get a citizenship, and by that to ask for a lot of EU rights, welfare, protection, and so on, they decided to stop it, to, let's say, relax it down a bit, the rights that immigrants are granted. So currently in Europe, Belgium, Germany, Ireland, and Portugal have the so-called conditional EU soli, which is applied bearing on the condition that the parents have resided in the country for a certain period of time before the child's birth. So the minimum parental residence is required by Ireland, which is 3 years, while the longest is in Belgium, which is 10 years. In other EU countries like France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain, children born in the country from foreign citizens can acquire citizenship at birth if at least one of their parents was also born in the country, without necessarily meaning that that person also has citizenship. In Belgium and Greece, instead, citizenship can be acquired through conditional double EU soli, which I mentioned in that diagram. And for instance, Belgium requires 5 years of prior residence for parents, while Greece, the permanent residence status for parents. It must be pointed out that some of the states considered offering different forms of EU soli. For instance, Belgium and Portugal have both conditional, have different types of conditional EU soli, and these kind of policies are actually changing a lot during the last few years. In the UK, since the 1st of January 1983, at least one parent must be a British citizen or be legally settled in the country, or upon the 10th birthday of the child, regardless of their parents' citizenship status. So what I'm trying to conclude here is that a populist reading of citizenship exists, but this is mostly theoretical. If we actually take the policies adopted in the different member states, whether this is in Europe or the US or Canada, it is not a strictly populist idea as we know it from other concepts, from the rule of law or from other types of concepts. It is mostly a nativist approach, and it is mostly an extreme need for assimilation, which is almost racist in its nature, but not necessarily populist. And I will, of course, hear your own opinion on this. Now, how are we overcoming these populist and nativist approaches towards citizenship? So the question that we are always trying to answer, and all of these right-wing parties are trying to answer, is how far citizenship should be limited to co-nationals who share certain ethnic or cultural characteristics, so that we either do not have this distinction of the people and the others, the corrupt others, or if specific parties want this kind of distinction, where do they limit the citizenship? So I already mentioned before that solidarity and trust are vital to any cooperative attempt, and they are mutually reinforcing. So democracy assumes a people or demos who feel sufficient solidarity with each other to accept collective decisions and enough mutual trust to cooperate. So without solidarity, individuals would be tempted to obey only those collective decisions that benefited themselves. Majorities may be unwilling to accommodate minorities, and minorities to accept the majority's decisions. Also, welfare similarly depends on the haves of other people, showing solidarity towards the have-nots. So the people who are wealthier and are more, let's say, I forgot the word, but they are more wealthy and they have more resources, show solidarity towards the people that are not equally wealthy with them. And trust, again, is very important, because trust and welfare together with solidarity create what we need to have a sufficiently effectively working society, if you want. So the question is, how far should citizenship go? How open should this membership be to ensure that welfare, solidarity, and trust exist? And of course, that we are overcoming any types of populist or narrativist approaches. So a common nationality is said to foster solidaristic and trusting feelings by creating a common identity that draws a shared culture, history, and language. So the solution to this is to create a common nationality. Now, is this really possible to have a common nationality? So shared culture, history, and language supposedly create a bond between people that reaches beyond their many differences of opinion and interest, and enables them to cooperate with each other. So this claim is partly sociological, partly normative, and partly functional in its nature. So firstly, people find it easier to engage with and trust those whom they regard as similar in certain pertinent ways. Secondly, cooperative activities such as democracy and welfare that I mentioned before involve more than the humanitarian obligations we owe to people in general. And they entail a high degree of reciprocity, of solidarity between people, and the sort of special obligations to particular others that exist among family members or good neighbors and so on. So not only are such obligations difficult to create and sustain among all human beings, but also people of differing cultures and people that want to shape things in different ways. Last but not least, a shared language and political traditions greatly facilitate communication and decision making. So it's making it easier for all to participate on equal terms and reducing the scope of misunderstanding or incompatibility clashes. On this account, therefore, nationality defines citizenship. However, there is another part of this debate which says the opposite. So obviously, nationality provides a social glue that enables the citizens to interact on equal terms in the life of a political community. And while state building and nation building was hand in hand in the past, even during the ancient Athenian years, there are obvious problems in drawing too tight connections between nationality and citizenship. So it is estimated that there are between 5,000 and 9,000 ethnic cultural groups in the world and only around 200 states. So obviously, I'm not a mathematician, but over 90% of these countries contain more than one ethnic group. So to overcome this diversity and to connect again nationality and citizenship, so nation building and citizen building, in the past, we have seen genocides taking place, forced mass population transfers, coerced assimilation, domination, and controlled by the ruling group. So with most states being formed through war, indigenous people and minority, national, religious, ethnic, and linguistic groups have suffered from this sort of oppression, as have later immigrant minorities. And of course, no respectable advocate of nationalism today believes that these kind of methods are in any way acceptable. And indeed, they argue that a common nationality can only accommodate diversity, but it's not the easiest thing to do. So how can this common nationality be achieved in ways that populist and nativist approaches are not part of this definition of this common nationality? So we're not talking about a common nationality that is characterized by the populist division of citizens and not citizens, but we're talking about a common nationality that facilitates all the different ethnic minorities. So such requirements are consistent with citizens giving their commitment to the state, having some knowledge of its political history and institutions, and being reasonably fluent in its main language or languages, and having an appreciation of the cultural conventions and sensibilities of its members. And indeed, in Western democracies, there have been increasing codification of elements of common national citizenship that is enshrining them both in tests and ceremonies for the acquisition of citizenship, as I explained. Now, typically policies of wanting to assimilate people more in the societies and in the cultures arise from responses of fears of growing multicultural unrest and rising rates of immigration and delusion, let's say, of the original native culture of a country. And as a result, there has been high criticism in certain quarters that these policies should be replaced by considerations based on human rights norms and international law. So rather than trying to extremely assimilate people into the common nationality, we go for a more facilitative way to consider human rights and so on. So the short response from a nationalist would be that rights norms will always need to be realized within a given cultural context, which fleshes them out in specific ways. Moreover, such acculturations will never be neutral in their effects. So choices will have to be made, for instance, about public holidays, public languages, official languages, and so on and so forth. So how are we able to divide these two categories of policies towards a more common nationality? So the discriminatory effects of types of decisions that are more, let's say, looking for choices of public holidays or official languages, or are trying to extremely assimilate citizens in other cultures, can be assisted from policies that are promoting a common national citizenship accompanied with an equally clear commitment to multiculturalism and diversity. So, for instance, there can be exemptions from laws that penalize certain cultural practices, such as the British exemption of Sikhs from wearing the motorcycle helmets, or there can be assistance for minorities to overcome certain disadvantages, for instance, from state support for cultural activities, including the funding of religious schools in the UK and the symbolic recognition of their acceptance, for instance, through multi-faith policies for religious education and public ceremonies, or other types of cultural practices allowed that are closer to religion. For instance, the stunning of animals is an exception on the EU level, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that rather than trying to, and I will put this in quotation, rather than trying to push and pressure people to accept mutual norms of political cooperation, we can rather try to facilitate differences in culture and ethnicity. However, in any polity, there are limits to how much accommodation is possible, and notably when minority practices are deemed to infringe human rights. For example, Western democracies have outlawed practices, the so-called practices female circumcision, which is very painful and of course violating any type of human right procedure. And however, numerous hard cases exist, still exist, particularly with regard to education of children and attributes towards women that are subordinate in culture and in society. So in these cases, a potential tension exists between the maintenance of certain traditional practices and protecting the opportunity of children, and particularly women, to choose whether they abide by traditional norms or adapt or even drop them altogether, exploring instead a wider possibility open to them in the broader community. So these tensions have been resolved in different ways in different member states, but a sign of a commitment to common citizenship derives from all affected parties seeking solutions that are capable of being justified in mutually acceptable terms. So in these ways, a national citizenship ceases to be something imposed by a dominant group on others, but a shared civic project involving a degree of compromise and adaptation on all sides. So this is everything that I wanted to mention on membership, and there is just another very short bit that I want to focus on. Sorry, did I stop sharing my screen? Let me share it again. So this is the part of, can you see my screen now? My slides.
Yes, now it's back on.
Okay, thank you. So what we basically covered in this almost 1.5 hours is the membership and how populist approaches have affected the membership of citizenship. I also want to just take another 5 or 10 minutes to discuss participation a bit, because I think it's also relevant to the rule of law if I have time, and I will try to leave at least half hour for discussion. Is that okay, Andreas?
Perfectly fine, yes, no problem.
Okay, excellent. So let me put this in the full screen. Okay, so the third component, but maybe the second as well, component of citizenship, as I explained, is participation, according to David Hill's understanding that I discussed before. So when we are part of a community, we can influence it, participate in its development, and contribute to its well-being. And therefore, citizenship is also understood as a practice, the practice of playing an active role in our society. Such participation may be within our neighborhood or in a formal or informal social group in our country or in the wider world. So the notion of active citizenship implies working towards the betterment of one's community through participation to improve life for all members of the community, not necessarily the citizens per se of that community, the community as a whole, whether this is referring to citizens or non-citizens. And democratic citizenship is a closely related concept, which emphasizes the belief that citizenship should be based on democratic principles and values such as pluralism, respect for human dignity, and the rule of law. So it is presenting an aspect of citizenship that does not leave any room for violations of human rights or the rule of law, whether this is within the actual participation in a community or whether this is in the membership to a community. So without the full spectrum of human rights, participation becomes difficult, if not impossible, to access. And for instance, poor health, low levels of education, restrictions on expression and poverty all impact our ability to take part in the processes and structures which affect us and our rights. And equally, without participation as a component of citizenship, many human rights are difficult to access. It is participation through which we can build a society based on human rights, develop social cohesion, make our voice heard, to influence decision makers, achieve change, and eventually be the subject and not the object of our own lives. And the question I want to pose, and I will finish, is whether you think that the populist rhetoric, as I explained it before in the framework of membership, can be detrimental to democratic citizenship. So the way that maybe populist politicians on the left or the right side and governments view the formal institutions, or if they view democracy as a corrupted creation, whether this can be detrimental to this type of democratic perspective of citizenship. And that's all I wanted to say. So let me stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I was not too boring because it was also a long workshop. And as I said, I am open to discussion, to suggestions, whether you think that populism may be affecting citizenship in a way that I have not identified, that would be useful. So I'm opening the floor to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And thanks for some very interesting insights into the relationship between citizenship and populism. So if anyone has any questions, you can again either write them in the chat or activate your microphone and ask your question. If anyone in the room has any comments or questions, feel free to offer them. Alexandra, yes, please. If you want to come closer to the microphone, just in case.
Okay. Hi, Katerina. Hello.
Hello, Alexandra. I cannot see your face, but I can hear your voice.
I don't. Yes. It's like a voice from.
I can see you now.
Yes. Hi. Hello. Thank you for your great lecture. I would like to ask you, how do you assess within the context of everything that you explained, and this issue of granting back the citizenship for Jewish people coming back to or just getting the citizenship in Portugal, right? It's in Portugal. I think there is law granting the citizenship to the Jews that were expelled, had to, or the grandchildren of these Jews who had to flee and leave Portugal some centuries ago. Does it fit anyhow into this context of this democratic citizenship and building like a community of values also through the citizenship right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So Alexandra, should I answer the question now or should I wait for more and then?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, can you mute your microphone? Sorry. It's just echoing a lot. So yes, this is an example actually of how all the different member states are free to grant citizenship as they want to, in their own terms, and whether they choose to have more inclusive perspectives or more exclusive perspectives. Of course, this falls within a more democratic citizenship. And I'm assuming that if we looked at this from a more populist or nativist approach, I haven't read actually potential reactions of right-wing parties in Portugal or elsewhere in Europe, but I'm assuming that the reaction would be exactly what I discussed on the nativist approach and the more authoritarian approach, where the Portuguese people, the original people, the native, should be separated from people that do not have that assimilation to the country, that close assimilation to the country. So yes, obviously this is an example of democratic citizenship. I'm not aware and I'm not sure of the intentions and the more long-term, let's say, objectives of the government and what they are trying to achieve by this type of policy. But we have previously seen a lot of countries changing their policies to grant citizenship either to people that are fleeing from the war or people that were assimilated to the country some generations before. So these are very common practices, and these are practices, of course, that are not welcomed to countries that are following more narrativist, nativist, approaches. And it's also a good example because I also wanted to focus more on the financial crisis because I didn't have time, but I think it's useful. Another example, which is relevant, not directly relevant, but close to what Alexandra mentioned, is, it's close to how free the member states are to grant citizenship. And for instance, in Cyprus, after the haircut of the accounts in the banks, the Cypriot government decided to grant citizenship through the investment scheme, the citizenship by investment scheme, to anyone who has lost a specific amount of money through the haircut. So anyone basically for some time who was affected by the haircut, so a huge financial implications, in other words, could automatically be granted a citizenship. So member states are really free as to how they can grant citizenship, and it's really not up to the EU to say, unless the practices adopted to grant the citizenship are in any way directly or indirectly affecting EU concepts, if you want.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they'd like to ask? I myself have some thoughts, Katerina, so I'll offer them to you and do with them what you wish. It seems to me that you've proposed a broad model of citizenship. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, it's just that when you talked about participation towards the end, the participation you described seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, non-institutionalized. So it's not about participating in the political system through established legal mechanisms or avenues. So it's not about taking a case to the court or engaging in lawful protest and anything like that. It's more diffuse. It's about participating in democratic processes and the local community, for instance, or social practices and so forth. So I'm wondering if this diffuse model of participation gives rise to such a broad concept of citizenship that is not something that member states within the EU adopt today, right? And therefore kind of falls into a spectrum. So for instance, if we take a mean account of citizenship existing in member states today, then the kind of citizenship you propose seems to be on one end of the spectrum, sort of more diffuse and broad, and then on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, we might have something like the more restrictive nativist accounts of citizenship that seek to restrict not just membership, but also those avenues of participation that you've described. Is that a fair assessment of what you described?
Yes, it is. Let me also share the table that I created with the components so that I can maybe illustrate it a bit better. Just let me share this. So, so just to give you an idea, because participation is also, I mean, I used almost all of my time to discuss membership, and I could use another 3 hours discussing participation. So participation is has a lot of ramifications, if you want, same way as membership does. But I just wanted to refer to it because it's relevant to the rule of law, more or less. So participation, and the question is how can you make democracy participatory enough through citizenship? Because back in ancient Athens, whoever was a citizen, they automatically became rulers of the law. They were part of the branches of the government, if you want. So whoever was a citizen was automatically participating in the democracy. They were making the laws, they were ruling the laws, and so on. Now, participation nowadays, direct participation is very hard because not everyone obviously can participate in the decision-making processes as MPs or as ministers and so on. So what do we mean as participation as a component of citizenship is a more abstract idea of how democratic citizenship can become. And actually, active citizenship and democratic citizenship is something that is currently promoted a lot from the EU. So what they're trying to do is to, let's say, urge the citizens or even the residents, if you want, of a community to become more active in ways that is not only voting in the elections, it's not only watching the news and being updated, but it's also people participating in social groups or in NGOs or in any way they can to become active in the development of a neighborhood, in the development of let's say, community, and this includes, of course, the development and the assistance of minorities in those communities. So the democratic perspective of citizenship, as it is currently promoted from the EU, and it's relevant to the participation component of citizenship, is also a way to develop regions and to assist minorities to become part of those communities without necessarily holding the status of citizenship. Does this make it clearer?
It is clear, and so what I'm going to say now is partly that inspired by Aristotle, as a matter of fact. So it seems to me that there are two distinct questions here. The first question is what it is to be a citizen, and the second question is what it is to be a good citizen. And it appears to me that the model of citizenship that you've described is conflating the two. Not that it's a problem, right? It's just that it makes it easier for me to understand what you're saying if I think of it like that. So, for example, if we take the model of citizenship adopted by Cyprus or another member state, to be a citizen has nothing necessarily to do with participation in social practices or politics or whatever it might be. To be a good citizen, sure, it might be about engaging in public discourse and participating in politics or whatever it might be. So maybe this distinction can help us understand a little bit better what you're suggesting here. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's just how I understood what you were describing in terms of participation being linked to citizenship. Because the link to citizenship that you provide seems to be more relaxed, right? Not a necessary component of citizenship. So not in terms of what it means to be a citizen, but more in the sense of what it means to be a good citizen or an active citizen, as we say, which I think is also the way that the EU promotes citizenship, incidentally, right? It's not about if you don't participate, you're not a citizen. It's more in the sense, oh, if you want to be a good or active citizen, participate.
Yes, exactly. So what it means to be a citizen and what a citizen is, how a citizen is defined, is part of the membership component. So how you enter this exclusive club in a way is what characteristics you need to have, what conditions you need to satisfy, and so on. Now, you are right that the participation is part of the understanding of citizenship I chose to use. Other scholars, besides David Held, would not define citizenship using these three components, although most of them do. So this is like the established idea of citizenship in more theoretical perspective, and participation is not necessarily there to make you either like a good citizen, but it's there to give you these degrees of belonging. So participation is not really meaning to be active in the community, but it's just there to show a kind of, let's say, a sense of belonging in a community. Now, there are other scholars that have developed like a scale and they are kind of measuring participation. So they are assessing the different types of participation, because there are also different types of participation within the components of citizenship, and there is a type of participation, the lowest level, let's say, which is just belonging, without necessarily meaning that you are becoming active. And this is, of course, also relevant to how nativist and populist the ideas are, and maybe how the government is functioning. And because the more liberal the government is, if you want, and the more the more inclusive they are, participation could also have an impact on how minorities are treated in a way, or how ethnic groups are treated. So yes, participation is not necessarily a component of citizenship, practically speaking. It's just the theoretical background of it, which is giving us this sense of belonging somewhere. So you are becoming a member, you have rights and duties, and you have this sense of belonging somewhere. But that does not necessarily mean that all countries have the same type of active citizenship or democratic citizenship. There are, of course, countries that do not allow any participation into the community, because they are more conservative, or because they are more rigid in their schemes and governance. So membership is the same for all the countries. I mean, they have conditions. You satisfy the conditions, you become a member of that citizenship, without, of course, meaning that all the conditions are fair and so on. Rights and duties, again, kind of similar. Again, depending on the country where you come from, you have less rights or more rights. If you are a woman in Saudi Arabia, you have less rights than a man, but you have equal citizenship status. Participation is the same. For some regions, participation is meaning more active citizenship and more participation towards the community and the betterment of the community, while for other countries is merely the sense of belonging. You can belong in this exclusive club, let's say.
Clear. Thanks very much, Katerina. Does anyone have any other questions or comments on what Katerina has suggested? Vasily, sure. It's not a question, so you can ask a question here.
Hi, Katerina.
Hello, Basil. How are you?
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture with many inputs. And due to this fact that I am involved in research on common good, I'd like to ask you two questions. The first one, what do you think, how it's possible, or how could be useful the policy of commonship for creation of public or common good, for example, in relationships to migrants or especially refugees? And the second one, which of EU countries you think it's such with special pro-common good of citizenship, including migrants or refugees, for example, in relationships to current war in Ukraine, and including also Ukrainian refugees? Thanks.
Sorry, Basil, can you repeat your first question if you can, because I lost the connection there for some minutes.
Basil, would you like to repeat your question? Sorry, because the connection was interrupted.
Or
there.
if you want to sum it up for me, Andreas, if it's easier.
I apologize. I mentioned that I'm involved in research on common good, and in this context, my first question concern, what do you think how policy of citizenship could be useful for creation of common good or public good, especially in relationship to migrants or refugees, including these refugees of the last year, or the refugees from a few years ago, especially from Syria. And the second question concerns your opinion, which EU country and its policy citizenship is such much more useful for creation of this public or common good in a relationship to refugees and generally for helping create this commonality of these refugees and native people or citizens of these EU countries. Which of these EU countries you think that it's such much more useful or pro citizenship creation relationship to migrants and refugees?
Thank you very much, Basil, for repeating your questions. Andrea, if you can mute your microphone. Thank you. So, okay, so regarding the first question on the common good, so it's a very hard question to answer because, as I said, in the EU, which is my field, the policies on migration and citizenship remain on the member states to decide. So whatever is EU regulated is relevant to a cross-border situation. So the EU can basically only intervene when there is a Canadian husband of a Cypriot coming to Cyprus but not living in Cyprus. It's only the situation where the person is moving outside their own country, which is where you trigger EU law, which is where you trigger this cross-border situation. So because there is so much discrepancy in the national laws, especially on citizenship, it is really hard to say how these could be, let's say, harmonized in a way for a more common good, or how this could change in more integrated terms. Now, in terms of an example of a country, I am not aware if the member states have adopted any special regimes on citizenship status for Ukrainians. I don't think they have done that, but of course the Union has adopted a more flexible and lenient, let's say, procedure of granting residence rights to Ukrainian people, which was not the case before for other types of refugees. This is for maybe another discussion, maybe like more political one. But the Union is trying to let's say, harmonize as much as possible the areas that it's allowed to harmonize. So there is a mechanism on refugees that is used for all the member states, but if you ask me, is not as effective as it could have been. So in terms of which country I would say is maybe more effective, I wouldn't say. I'm not aware if there is a country that is more effective currently with the Ukrainian war or previously, in terms of which one is more flexible or more or broader in the rights that they are granting. But it's of course, I mean, if we are talking about Europe, EU citizenship is actually one of the most important inventions, if you want, in the citizenship studies. And countries that currently benefit from citizenship of the Union, so EU member states, are having their passports very, very high in the rankings of let's say, which is the most effective or most useful citizenship at the moment. Because if you are a member of the European Union and if you hold EU citizenship, is granting you not only rights, the list that I gave, but also other types of rights that are relevant to traveling globally, having rights globally, having consular protection globally sometimes. So it's not a particular country, I would say, but more or less the idea of a union citizenship, I think, is very useful. And it's also sometimes connected with residence rights that are granted to members that are not part of the union, but have free movement in the union or entering the union without visas. So this is also relevant to EU citizenship and other passports throughout Europe more generally. I hope I answered your questions, Vasil.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Is there anyone else who'd like to say or ask something from those online? If you have any questions or comments, you can add them in the chat. Thank you, Angelina, for your beautiful words. No? Okay, well, with that, Katerina, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. That was an excellent start to our summer school. So thanks very much. We are going to now take a short 10-minute break, and then we're going to resume with our first guest lecture of the summer school. So please stay in the chat. I'm simply going to stop the recording and